She just wanted to rent a boyfriend for the holidays, but sent the message to the wrong man. He turned out to be a millionaire, exhausted from corporate life. Before we dive into this compelling story, we invite you to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support our work. We hope you enjoy it. On the freezing morning of December 19th, the sky over New York was thick with gray clouds, and the biting wind made Samantha Reed regret not choosing a heavier scarf. She walked quickly along the damp sidewalks of Brooklyn, balancing a cup of hot coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, replying to a flood of messages in the family group chat. The questions came fast, as they did every year. Are you bringing someone to dinner, Sam? Still single or finally dating someone? She rolled her eyes at each notification, trying not to let her annoyance show. At 27, with a demanding job as a production assistant at a small event agency, she barely had time to eat properly, let alone find the perfect boyfriend to meet her family's expectations. That same afternoon, back at the small apartment she shared with a friend in Greenpoint, Samantha had a rare moment of peace. Sitting on the couch with a blanket over her legs and her laptop closed at her side, she called her best friend, Danielle, for a quick video chat. She talked about the family pressure, the unspoken expectations, and her certainty that, once again, showing up alone to the Christmas Eve dinner would make her the target of all the wrong attention. Danielle listened patiently from the other end and then tossed out an idea that, at first, sounded ridiculous. Sam, what if you just rented a boyfriend for the night? Just to shut everyone up. No one has to know. Samantha laughed in disbelief. But after the call ended, the absurd idea kept echoing in her mind. She picked up her phone, opened the browser, and typed, "Holiday Event Escorts NYC." Most of the first results looked sketchy, but one name kept appearing in low-key forums with solid reviews. Curious, she jotted down the number and sent a quick message. The message was direct and to the point. "Hi, I'd like to know if you offer companions for family dinners during the holidays." Nothing romantic, just someone polite, discreet, and reliable. What Samantha didn't know was that, while typing the agency's number, she accidentally swapped one digit. Instead of contacting a trained professional, the message landed directly in the inbox of Derek Holloway, a name she didn't recognize, but one that would soon become impossible to forget. At that moment, Derek was seated in his private jet cabin, returning from a week of grueling meetings in Chicago. As the CEO of a tech holding company managing multiple startups and investments, Derek could barely remember the last time he had taken a real break. His phone buzzed among the usual barrage of corporate emails. When he opened the new message, his eyes narrowed in surprise. "Hi, I'd like to know if you offer companions." He read it more than once. At first, he thought it was spam, but there was something oddly sincere about the message, as if it came from someone genuinely in social distress. It wasn't offensive. It sounded like a real, almost naive request. Derek could have easily ignored it, but something about the woman's direct tone, a trace of vulnerability, caught his attention. He was tired, bored with the corporate routine, and for a moment, the idea of escaping the role of hard-edged executive for a few days seemed more appealing than drowning in spreadsheets. On an impulse that went against everything he usually did, he replied, "Sure, want to talk more about the dates and details," and hit send before he could think twice. Samantha got the reply minutes later. She felt a flutter in her stomach as she realized someone had actually responded, and even more so when she read the affirmative answer. She typed quickly, "Thanks for getting back to me. It's really simple, just for Christmas Eve, or maybe a few days through New Year's, depending on how it goes." Nothing romantic, just someone convincing enough to keep the awkward questions away. On the other end, Derek read each new message with growing curiosity. The woman's practical tone, her honesty in explaining the situation, Everything made him feel like there was something genuine here. She wasn't looking for fun or scandal. She just wanted to survive a suffocating family environment. As strange as it seemed, he understood and decided to go along with the idea. They agreed to meet in person 2 days later at a quiet cafe in Williamsburg to go over the details. Samantha still thought it all felt surreal, but believed the meeting would make things clearer, and maybe the escort would come off as trustworthy in person. Derek, on his end, ended the call smiling. He slipped the phone into his pocket, leaned back in his seat, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about mergers, contracts, or quarterly results. He was thinking about a strange woman who, by mistake, had invited him to play along in a holiday charade. And he said yes, not for the money, not for the challenge, but because of something he couldn't quite explain. He just knew he needed a break from himself, and maybe this woman was the perfect excuse. On the afternoon of December 21st, the cold had only gotten worse in New York. The sky remained dull, and a light drizzle that had fallen since morning made the air even sharper. Samantha arrived at the Williamsburg Cafe a few minutes early, brushing the light snow from her hood and adjusting her coat collar before stepping inside. The warm interior, softly lit by amber lights, offered a cozy contrast to the frozen atmosphere outside. She chose a table near the window, where she could watch the cars and pedestrians go by, and took a moment to mentally review the points she needed to discuss. She still couldn't quite believe she was about to hire a complete stranger, or almost that, to pretend to be her boyfriend for Christmas. The idea still felt absurd, yet there was something oddly comforting in its practicality. A clear agreement, no emotional entanglement, just a way to navigate the minefield of family gatherings unscathed. Derek arrived right on time, as if he were used to keeping punctual appointments. But unlike the polished executive featured in finance news and industry magazine covers, he showed up dressed casually. Dark jeans, a gray sweater, a tailored black coat, and a relaxed posture that softened his sharp facial features. When she saw him approach, Samantha immediately recognized the man from the profile photo, the same one he had strategically sent after their message exchange to make the meeting easier. She gave a subtle wave, and he sat down across from her with a smile that blended kindness and mild curiosity. They studied each other briefly. Then she thanked him for being on time and for agreeing to something so unusual. He replied that he had no plans for the holiday, and her proposal sounded like an interesting break from the corporate grind that had worn him down for months. Samantha didn't waste time and began explaining things clearly. She told him her family lived in a small town in Connecticut and that they gathered every Christmas Eve for a traditional dinner, followed by a few days of activities and rituals that lasted through New Year's. She explained that the issue wasn't being with her family, but the questions, the same ones every year. When are you getting married? What about kids? You work so much, but what about your personal life? She said it all without bitterness, just with the exhaustion of someone used to hearing the same pressures on repeat. Derek listened closely, never interrupting, absorbing every detail with an expression that showed interest rather than obligation. When she finished, he nodded, saying he completely understood. He didn't judge. He didn't mock her. He simply asked, "So how exactly do you want us to present this story to your family?" They then began aligning the details with practical focus. Samantha suggested they stick to a simple, believable story. Something like, "We met at an event in Manhattan, started seeing each other 2 months ago, and we're getting to know each other better when the holiday invitation came up." She emphasized there was no need for over-the-top public affection, just enough to seem like a real couple. Derek agreed with everything and even offered suggestions. He asked about her family style, whether they should have shared interests like movies, music, favorite foods. Samantha was surprised at how much attention he gave to the little things, which made it all feel more realistic. They even came up with inside details, private jokes, made up memories of a dinner at a fictional bistro in the Lower East Side, and even a symbolic gift he'd give her on Christmas morning. The conversation lasted over an hour, with pauses only for sips of coffee and occasional laughter when Samantha described her quirky uncles and the grandmother who loved offering romantic advice disguised as baking recipes. Derek, little by little, stopped being a mysterious figure and became someone tangible, someone who responded with ease and showed a sense of humor. There was something comforting in how seriously he took the arrangement. He didn't brush it off or treat it as some silly whim. On the contrary, he treated it with respect, like it was more than just a role to play. Samantha started to relax, realizing that at least in this regard, she could count on him. In the end, they agreed to travel together on the morning of the 24th so they'd arrive at the Reed house before lunch and avoid raising suspicions. When they left the cafe, the snow had started to fall more heavily. They stopped at the entrance for a moment, exchanging one last look before heading off in opposite directions. Derek, hands tucked into his coat pockets, thanked her for the meeting and said he'd send a message confirming the time and station where they'd meet to catch the train. Samantha replied with a nod and a restrained smile, unsure what to make of the whole situation. It still felt like a crazy plan, but for now, all the details were clear and the thought of spending the holiday in peace with her family felt less out of reach than before. On the morning of December 24th, Samantha woke up before her alarm, driven by a restlessness that mixed anxiety with responsibility. After checking her phone and confirming the train time Derek had sent the night before, she got up to finish packing and go over the final details of the trip. She had set aside casual clothes, a few dresses suitable for family dinners, toiletries, and even a new set of pajamas, as if that could make everything feel more manageable. The idea of traveling with a stranger to her parents' house in Connecticut still felt risky, but out of all the available options, it seemed like the least exhausting. As she packed, Danielle sent encouraging voice notes, reminding her that if nothing else, the experience would at least make for a great story. Samantha responded with a short laugh, then turned off her phone and headed to the station. At Penn Station, the typical Christmas Eve crowd made even walking between platforms a challenge. People hurried with overstuffed luggage, kids wearing Santa hats buzzed with excitement, and loudspeaker announcements competed with the general buzz of conversation. Samantha scanned the crowd until she spotted Derek a few minutes later, leaning casually near the platform with a small suitcase and his phone in hand. He wore dark jeans, a navy wool jacket, and black boots, comfortable but put together. When he saw her, he smiled and walked over. They exchanged quick greetings and boarded the train together. Inside the car, they found two seats side by side near a window and settled in as the locomotive pulled away from the city. The urban scenery quickly gave way to frozen landscapes, bare trees, and small houses strung with twinkling lights in the distance. During the ride, Samantha took the opportunity to go over the last bits of their plan. She reviewed the names and personalities of her relatives, stressing that her mom was more observant than she looked and that her dad had a dry but harmless sense of humor. She told him about her younger brother, who always cracked jokes at family dinners, and her grandma, who loved asking couples about marriage, kids, and where they planned to live. Derek listened closely, like he was preparing for an important presentation. Now and then, he asked precise questions to lock in the details. How they met, where their first date supposedly was, what kind of music they listened to together. The answers evolved into small stories they built on the spot, surprisingly naturally, as if they had truly lived those moments. In between rehearsing their script, they drifted into lighter conversation, sharing thoughts on books, movies, and travel. Time passed faster than Samantha expected. When they got off the train at the small town station, a blast of cold air hit their faces. Samantha adjusted her beanie, pulled her suitcase behind her, and pointed toward the platform exit. Outside, the gravel parking lot was already covered with a thin layer of snow, and her dad's old SUV waited with fogged-up windows and the engine running. Mr. Reed stepped out, smiled as he spotted them, and opened the trunk to load their bags. Derek was introduced as Sam's boyfriend and greeted her dad with a firm handshake and a polite tone, just as they had planned. Her dad didn't comment. He just got back in the car and drove them home, while Samantha and Derek exchanged a brief, silent glance in the back seat. The road was lined with ice-covered trees, and a few houses in the distance had lit fireplaces and wreaths on their doors. Samantha recognized every curve and sign, her heart beating faster as they neared the home she grew up in. The arrival was smooth, with the family welcoming them warmly, though clearly curious about the unexpected guest. Her mom hugged her first, then greeted Derek with reserved friendliness, studying him closely. Her grandmother, seated near the fireplace, looked up and smiled at the sight of her granddaughter arriving with someone. A few cousins showed up shortly after, followed by Aunt Lisa and Uncle Ron. Introductions went smoothly, with Derek maintaining a confident posture, speaking little but with clarity. When asked how they met, he and Samantha repeated the story they had rehearsed on the train with such natural ease that it satisfied everyone. The lack of exaggerated details and the relaxed tone helped convince the family that, while new, the relationship seemed solid. During coffee in the kitchen, Derek offered to help Samantha's mom with the dishes, earning nods of approval and positive remarks from her uncles. Later in the afternoon, once guests had temporarily dispersed and the house grew quieter, Samantha took Derek to the guest room, a simple space with a double bed, an old dresser, and thick curtains. She pointed out where the extra blankets were and explained the mealtime schedule, keeping a practical tone despite feeling a little tense. Derek thanked her, dropped his bag by the bed, and commented that he felt very welcomed. They then returned to the living room, where the fireplace still crackled and her grandmother watched an old Christmas special on TV. They sat side by side on the couch, no words necessary. The first part of their mission was complete. The welcome had gone well, no one seemed suspicious, and they were now officially immersed in the Reed family environment. As evening approached, the Christmas tree lights reflected in the windows, and the scent of cinnamon and homemade cookies began to fill the house. On the night of December 24th, the Reed house was filled with the scent of roasted dishes, cinnamon, and burning firewood in the fireplace. The living room was decorated with warm yellow lights in the windows, a Christmas tree loaded with family ornaments, and a few candles lit on the side table. Samantha was setting out glasses and napkins beside her mother, who was checking the doneness of the recipes, while Derek discreetly helped her father open a bottle of wine in the dining room. Everything moved with the rhythm of old traditions, where each gesture seemed repeated over the years, but still held meaning. Derek's presence had been absorbed with surprising ease, and he remained attentive to the details, participating without overstepping, observing and interacting with a familiarity that didn't feel forced. Samantha, even focused on the preparations, watched him from a distance at times, try to understand whether it was just social finesse or something more. Just before dinner, family members began arriving in small groups. Cousins, uncles, and close neighbors settled into the living room, bringing boxes of chocolates, fruitcakes, wine, and accumulated stories. Derek was introduced to each one with confidence and politeness, quickly remembering names and improvising short comments that generated friendliness without sounding rehearsed. When a curious uncle asked how they'd met, he calmly repeated their agreed story, adding a small detail about a dinner in Manhattan that drew a subtly surprised look from Samantha. Not because he got it wrong, but because it sounded genuine. The way he handled the interactions made others feel at ease. Samantha noticed this with a mix of relief and a pleasant kind of strangeness, as if she were being spared the discomfort that, in previous years, had always been inevitable. Dinner was served promptly at 8, with the family seated around the main table, adorned with embroidered tablecloths, old china, and a centerpiece of pine branches and low candles. Samantha sat next to Derek, and between them, there was a growing ease that didn't need to be forced with calculated gestures. When someone joked about how the relationship was going, she replied with a short smile, and Derek followed up with a light comment about spending their first Christmas together, saying he was enjoying the chance to meet the family. The approving looks from the closest relatives made Samantha realize how that simple exchange had muffled the questions that, in previous years, would have lingered all night. The food passed around amid laughter, old stories, and occasional toasts, and the evening progressed with the kind of warmth that gradually lowered everyone's guard. After dessert, while most people moved to the living room to open presents or settle near the fireplace, Samantha and Derek lingered a bit longer at the table, speaking softly about her family. She shared small stories about the cousin who used to play guitar during childhood Christmases, the neighbor who always brought pudding uninvited, and the classic gifts her grandmother handed out every year. Usually socks, sometimes scented soap. Derek listened with genuine attention, his eyes fixed on her with a gentler expression, less concerned with playing a role and more engaged in the moment. Samantha spoke without worrying about appearances, and when she noticed that, she fell quiet for a second, maybe surprised at how at ease she felt. He didn't say anything. He just lightly touched her hand over the tablecloth in a brief gesture that seemed to carry more meaning than any scripted line. A little while later, they went upstairs together to where the bedrooms were. Samantha guided him down the hallway and stopped at the guest room door, explaining where the extra blankets and nearby bathroom were. He thanked her with a smile, and for a moment, they stood facing each other without needing to rush. Samantha held the doorknob to her own room, but hadn't turned it yet. Derek asked if she was okay, and she said yes, that everything had gone more smoothly than she'd expected. He nodded, said her family was welcoming, and that he was genuinely enjoying himself. Samantha responded with a near whisper, "I'm glad." And before the moment slipped away, she looked up at him with more certainty. Derek held her gaze for a few seconds, and there was a gentle tension between them, like an impulse ready to surface but stopping right at the line between natural and possible. Instead of crossing that line, Derek simply leaned in close enough to softly wish her good night. Samantha tilted her head slightly in response and briefly touched his forearm before entering her room. The door closed without a sound, and both went to bed with their minds still warm from what hadn't happened. In the quiet of the room, Samantha lay down, her body tired but her senses alert. She thought about the words exchanged, the gestures, the brief touch of his hand over hers, and felt that something had shifted that night. She didn't name it. She didn't have to. The house slowly fell asleep, with the last echoes of Christmas fading down the hallways and the quiet warmth of the bond forming between them lingering even in the dark. On the morning of December 25th, soft golden light filtered through the thin curtains in Samantha's childhood bedroom, casting a glow across the still rumpled sheets. She woke to the muffled sounds of voices coming from the kitchen and footsteps in the hallway, while the scent of fresh coffee, pancakes, and bacon began to drift upstairs. It took her a few seconds to get her bearings. Sitting up in bed, her loose hair falling over her shoulders, her face still carried traces of the night before. She pulled a sweatshirt over her pajamas, slipped on some socks, and opened the door quietly. In the hallway, she crossed paths with Derek, who was stepping out of the guest room wearing the same long-sleeve shirt from the night before, sleeves now rolled up, his hair slightly tousled. They exchanged a soft good morning, intimate in tone, as if they were still wrapped in the quiet bubble left over from Christmas Eve. They headed downstairs together, where Samantha's mom was pulling a tray of muffins out of the oven and her dad was pouring coffee from a thermal carafe, setting disposable cups on the counter. Her younger brother was already on the couch with a blanket and the TV remote, flipping through cartoons while waiting to open the remaining presents. Derek's entrance didn't cause any stir. He was welcomed naturally, handed a mug of coffee, without anyone asking what he wanted. Samantha watched all of this with a quiet kind of wonder, trying to pinpoint when exactly he had stopped being just a temporary guest. As they ate, they chatted about light things, the freezing night, the Christmas movie playing on TV, the pine scent from the natural tree filling the living room. Derek said little, but listened closely. Samantha talked more than usual, maybe because silence might have brought up what neither of them was ready to say. Later, once the living room had been tidied and torn wrapping paper gathered into a corner by the fireplace, Samantha's grandmother called everyone for photos. It was tradition to take at least one big family shot, followed by smaller ones in pairs or trios. Derek was included without hesitation, standing next to Samantha with quiet ease, his arm resting just behind her, not touching. She didn't pull away. In fact, she leaned subtly toward him while smiling for the camera. When her mom suggested a photo of the couples, Derek hesitated, but Samantha pulled him toward the lens, laughing and saying that this Christmas was photo album worthy. Her grandmother gave them a knowing wink, and the flash captured a simple moment. Reviewing the photo on the camera screen, Samantha noticed something in her own eyes. They looked softer. There was a sense of comfort that came from having him by her side. By late morning, relatives started saying their goodbyes. Cars lined up in front of the house, leftover food packed into bags, hugs exchanged along with promises to reunite next year. Samantha helped with dishes and wrapping, while Derek offered to carry bags out to the gate. The chattiest aunt thanked him warmly and whispered something into Samantha's ear before climbing into her car. Once everything quieted down and the house settled into a slower rhythm, Samantha and Derek found themselves on the back porch, where the family kept a table with padded benches and a thermos of hot chocolate. The ground was still damp from the night's dew, but they sat anyway, each with a mug in hand. Their conversation slowed. Samantha talked about the internship she would start in January, exams she still needed to take for college, and uncertainty about the future. Derek shared his plans to restart some projects in the new year. Neither was in a hurry to leave. As the afternoon wore on, Derek mentioned he should probably head out before it got too late, not wanting to overstay. Samantha said he didn't have to rush, that it was fine to stay. Her mother, overhearing from the kitchen, suggested he stay for dinner, and he thanked her with a restrained smile. Samantha went upstairs to retrieve something, leaving Derek alone for a few minutes. When she returned, she handed him a small brown box, no ribbon, no tag. She said it was just a little something, nothing big, and explained she had bought the pen a few days earlier at a stationery store near her college, thinking it might come in handy for someone like him, who seemed so meticulous. Inside was a dark metal pen with his name discreetly engraved along the side, a service she'd requested at the counter that same day, taking advantage of a pre-Christmas promotion. Derek stayed silent for a few seconds, then said no one had given him something so thoughtful in a long time. Samantha shrugged and said it had just felt right. He held the pen carefully, and the look they shared lingered longer than either of them expected. That evening, before leaving, Derek asked to speak with Samantha outside. They stood by the gate, the cold air making each second feel sharper. He thanked her for everything, for the warm welcome, for how included he had felt for the gift. He said he hadn't known what to expect from the weekend, but he was leaving with no regrets. Samantha told him he had done great, that the whole improvisation had worked. Derek looked at her and asked if they could see each other again. Samantha paused for a moment before answering, but when she did, it was clear. She said yes. And when he leaned in to kiss her, there was no hesitation. It was a firm, lingering kiss. Then he left. Samantha walked back into the house with cold hands and a head full of everything they had just shared. On the morning of December 26th, Samantha was woken by the buzz of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. It was still dark outside, and her childhood bedroom remained warm thanks to the heavy blankets and the relaxed comfort of a long day. She reached out, checked the screen, and saw a short message from Derek. Made it home. Thanks for everything. She read it twice before locking the phone and setting it aside. For a few moments, she stayed in bed, trying to piece her thoughts together. The day before still felt too close, as if it had been lived in a dream with vivid details that left real impressions. The kiss at the gate, the gift she gave him, the way everyone had welcomed him so easily. She got up slowly, tied her hair into a loose bun, and headed downstairs to help with breakfast, where the house was gradually settling back into its usual rhythm. She stayed one more day, enjoying her parents' company and the quiet calm of a house full of memories, before heading back to her apartment on the evening of the 26th. Throughout the day, Samantha tried to stay busy. She did laundry, organized her remote work files, cleaned her desk, and even answered emails she had been avoiding for days. But every so often, her mind returned to the night before. No new messages came through, and she wondered whether he was just resting or had already slipped back into his regular life. She didn't feel anxious, exactly, but there was a lingering question mark, like when something steps outside the script and calls for a choice that hasn't been made yet. Late in the afternoon, she sent a short message. It was nice having you around. It wasn't a question, nor a request, just a statement. An hour later, he replied, it was nice being there. The following days moved at the slow pace typical of the year's end. The neighborhood gradually emptied as neighbors traveled. Friends posted photos from other cities, and the streets grew quieter between Christmas and New Year's. Samantha spent more time at home than she had planned, partly to save money for the new month, partly because she didn't feel like going out. She and Derek exchanged sporadic texts, light topics, some funny, others nearly contentless, but with a thread of continuity that kept them in each other's orbit. Neither suggested meeting up again. It was as if they were waiting for time itself to bring the idea forward. One warmer afternoon, she was sitting on the couch with iced tea in hand when he sent a photo of his breakfast, burnt pancakes, and a shocked emoji. She laughed alone and replied that he needed basic lessons. He said he'd only take them if she was the teacher. New Year's Eve approached, and Samantha didn't have elaborate plans. Her parents were preparing a simple dinner at home. Her younger brother wanted to stay up to see the fireworks, and spending the night with familiar people felt just right. On the 31st, she helped her mom set up a table with cold dishes, fruits, soda, and a few typical appetizers. She wore a simple white dress, tied her hair with an old clip, and didn't think much of it. At 10 p.m., she received another message from Derek, still haven't decided where to spend midnight. She typed something, deleted it, typed again, and finally sent, "Things will be quiet here. My parents, my brother, and a cheese platter." He replied with a period, then followed up, "Can I come by?" She showed the screen to her mom, who nodded without asking anything. Her dad, hearing there be company, opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving. Derek arrived at 11:15 p.m., wearing dark jeans, a light blue shirt, and a casual jacket. He brought a bottle of sparkling wine and a last-minute dessert from the deli near his place. He was greeted with hugs and jokes about coming back so soon. Samantha didn't hide her smile. She was genuinely happy he came. They all gathered in the living room, watched a music special on TV, and 5 minutes before midnight, poured drinks. At the stroke of 12, Derek looked at Samantha before any toast. She smiled back. Their hug was tight, and when they pulled apart, she rested her forehead on his shoulder. No one said anything. It wasn't necessary. Later, while the city celebrated with distant fireworks, the two of them stood alone for a few minutes on the front porch. Samantha leaned her arms on the railing, and Derek stepped closer. They talked about hopes for the new year, not grand plans, just scattered thoughts. She mentioned work, wanting to change careers, dreaming of traveling someday. He spoke about reorganizing his schedule, focusing on his health, investing time in something with meaning beyond outcomes. Their conversation had long pauses, but no awkwardness. When the wind picked up, he took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. They stood like that in silence until the fireworks died out completely. Then they went back inside, and before he left, Derek kissed Samantha again, this time with less formality and more certainty. She walked him to the gate. When she came back in, she felt something had finally begun to take shape, something clearer. On the first days of January, Samantha jumped back into work with more focus than she expected. The tasks that had piled up over the holiday break demanded her full attention. Client emails, scheduling tweaks, supplier briefings. All of it consumed most of her day. Still, every now and then, she found herself rereading her recent messages with Derek, especially the last few. There were no promises, no clear definitions, just a flowing continuation, like a conversation paused mid-thought, waiting to be resumed. During lunch breaks, she stayed in, preferring to make something simple at home and enjoy the quiet of her own space. The days were cold, and her apartment felt more inviting with the soft winter light filtering through the windows in the late afternoon. Between one task and another, she would glance at her phone without a specific reason, just a faint hope of seeing his name appear again. On the first Friday of the year, around 8 in the evening, her phone buzzed. It was a video call from Derek. She hesitated for a moment before answering, quickly smoothing her hair and adjusting the collar of her sweatshirt. He appeared on screen looking relaxed, sitting somewhere that looked like his own apartment, lit by warm, low lighting and holding a mug. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he said. She shook her head with a smile. They talked for nearly an hour, swapping jokes, holiday memories, and snippets of daily life. The call ended without any expectations, just the lingering feeling that they were somehow closer. On Saturday, she texted him, "Still can't make decent pancakes?" He replied with a photo of a pan and the word, "Help." On Sunday afternoon, Derek asked if she'd like to have dinner together on Monday after work. Samantha read the message while sitting at her kitchen table, holding a glass of juice, her heart beating faster than the casual tone of his question should have warranted. She replied yes, and he sent the address of a cozy Italian restaurant in the Lower East Side. On Monday, the day dragged. She double-checked the same event timeline twice, distracted, and after work, got ready slowly. She chose a forest green sweater and dark jeans, pulled her hair into a neat ponytail, but paid attention to the details, a hint of perfume, a discreet pair of earrings. She took the subway early and arrived on time, finding Derek waiting on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and a smile that looked relieved to see her. The restaurant was small, softly lit in amber tones, with only a few occupied tables. They were seated in a quiet corner, and the mood between them shifted gently between playful banter and thoughtful silence, where their eyes held just long enough to make words unnecessary. They talked about how the year had started, their work plans, uncertainties, and half-formed hopes. With him, Samantha didn't feel the need to filter her thoughts, which was rare. When their meals arrived, they laughed at how they had ordered nearly the same thing. He complimented her sauce. She stole a bite from his plate. Once they finished, they decided to keep the evening short. They walked together to the corner and lingered there a few minutes. He asked if he could see her again the following week, and she said she'd like that. The kiss that followed was quiet, assured, without hesitation. On the subway ride home, Samantha rested her head against the window and let her body relax. She knew it was too soon to label anything, but she also recognized something new in herself, a readiness to try. Derek wasn't in a rush, and that helped. There was room to build slowly, without promises that didn't fit the moment. The following days were filled with small exchanges. A message about traffic, another about a podcast she had recommended, a photo from him at the grocery store holding 2 coffee brands and asking which to buy. Simple things, but steady, as if each message reminded the other they were still there. By the end of the week, they planned to meet again on Sunday for something even more low-key, a walk in the park and hot drink somewhere without a plan. Samantha said she was in and offered to bring extra gloves in case he forgot his. On Sunday, they met at the Central Park entrance near Strawberry Fields. The air was cold, but the sky was clear, and there was something pleasant in how easily they moved together. They chatted the whole time, joking about random passersby, a dog wearing boots, lost tourists, and street musicians covering Beatles songs. Later, they found a cafe nearby. Samantha ordered hot chocolate, Derek black coffee. They sat for over an hour. He talked about an old project he had set aside, and she encouraged him to pick it back up gently, without pressure. When they left, the wind had picked up, but they didn't mind. They walked a bit more until they reached her subway stop. As they said goodbye, he held her hand just a moment longer. They didn't say what it meant. For now, they didn't need to. On the following Wednesday, Samantha and Derek had dinner again, this time at a trendy Asian fusion restaurant in Soho. The place had dim lighting and a concise menu focused on creative pairings. Samantha arrived a few minutes after Derek, brushing snowflakes off her coat's shoulders as she entered. The hostess led them to a second-floor table with a partial view of the bustling street below. Once seated, they spent the first few minutes chatting about work, the erratic weather, and a winter festival happening that weekend. Their conversation flowed naturally, and the silences in between never felt awkward. When the main course arrived, Derek rested his elbows lightly on the edge of the table and gave her a brief, amused look. "Remember that message you sent me? The first one." Samantha nodded, picking up her chopsticks. He continued, "Well, you actually sent it to the wrong number." She paused, confused. "What do you mean?" Derek's smile widened. "I'm not part of any escort service. You got 1 digit wrong. The message came straight to my phone." Samantha froze, her chopsticks landing on the plate's edge. "You're joking." He shook his head lightly. "No, I was flying back from Chicago when I read it. At first, I thought it was spam, but the message felt too genuine, too honest. I couldn't ignore it." Samantha put her hand to her mouth, laughing and stunned. "So, I texted a completely random stranger? That's insane." Derek chuckled. "Technically, yes, but it worked out." I replied because you sounded brave. Or completely nuts. I haven't decided yet. She laughed louder, drawing a glance from the next table. After a moment, Samantha leaned back in her chair and looked at him with more clarity. "You know what's wild? I'm not even mad. If I had messaged the right number, I probably would have ended up with some guy trained in small talk. We never would have had this." Derek nodded. "I thought the same thing. It was a 1-digit mistake, but it became the best part of my holiday." They clinked their water glasses with a quiet tap and a shared smile. The rest of the evening was light. They shared dessert, laughed at other coincidences, and walked together to the subway. Along the way, Samantha mentioned maybe it was time to tell Danielle how it all really started, and Derek joked they should turn the story into a movie. "A holiday rom-com," he said. She replied, with an open ending. They stopped at the subway entrance, where the wind had picked up. Derek cupped her face with both hands, warming her cheeks with his thumbs before kissing her more deeply than before. As she descended the steps, she turned around. He was still there. On the train, surrounded by strangers, Samantha replayed every part of their conversation. She didn't feel exposed or foolish. On the contrary, everything felt more grounded. A mistake that opened a door, a decision that wasn't planned, and someone who stayed when they could have simply walked away. In the days following their dinner in Soho, Samantha and Derek kept in touch frequently, but now there was a new layer of intimacy between them. Not just because of the message mistake reveal, but because they both seemed more willing to share little by little. Their conversations became less filtered. They talked about professional fears, old regrets, awkward memories, and modest victories. Neither of them felt the need to impress the other. Samantha found it curious how Derek, despite being highly successful, spoke so openly about the insecurities he still carried, especially regarding all the time he had sacrificed for his career. Derek, in turn, showed genuine interest in every story she shared, from mishaps with clients to the chaos behind poorly managed events. Their dynamic shifted from circumstantial to something more present and intentional. One Saturday morning, Derek texted her asking if she'd like to spend the weekend out of town. It wasn't a grand proposal, just 2 days at a small and near beacon, with short trails, a fireplace, and a view of the river. Samantha hesitated for a few minutes. It wasn't typical of her to say yes to things like this, and the instinct to protect herself came up. But she answered yes. That same day, he confirmed the reservation and said he'd pick her up early Sunday. When he arrived, Samantha was ready, packed light, and bundled up in a lined jacket. The drive took about 2 hours, filled with music and conversations on random topics. Unfinished books, dishes they never learned to cook, places they still hope to visit. The check-in was smooth, and the cabin they got had a quiet charm. Lightwood walls, thick rugs, and wide windows facing the woods. That afternoon, they took a light hike on a nearby trail. Samantha wore gloves and a beanie, and Derek carried a thermos of coffee. The landscape was still and damp, with tree branches dusted in fine frost and the occasional birdsong overhead. They paused at a small overlook with a distant view of the Hudson River, cutting through the scenery like a silver ribbon under a pale sky. There, unhurried, they shared stories from their childhoods, the towns they grew up in, and the ties they still had to the past. Samantha spoke about her old school, the friends she'd lost touch with, and the feeling of not quite fitting in. Derek admitted that, despite everything he'd achieved, there was still something missing, something that had never been material. After that, they didn't say much. They simply stood there, side by side, breathing into the cold air. That night, they sat by the fireplace with mugs of tea and blankets draped over their legs. Samantha wore a loose-knit sweater and thick socks. Derek had brought a book but never opened it. Instead, they talked about what they would do if they could pause life for a while. He said he might live abroad for a year. She said she'd like to work on cultural projects with less commercial pressure. The conversation tapered off into quiet, and at some point, he moved closer. The kiss they shared was unlike the others, slower, not sparked by a moment, but by the slow build of wanting. When Samantha rested her head on his shoulder, he didn't say a word. He just wrapped an arm around her, and they stayed like that until the fire crackled low. The night ended with them sharing the same bed, without rushing to make a turning point. It just felt right for that moment. The next morning, they woke up to filtered daylight through the curtains and the distant sound of wind outside. They had breakfast on the cabin porch, wrapped in blankets, mugs perched on the wooden railing. They didn't talk much. The mood between them was calm, like something had settled. On the drive back to New York, they spoke about the week ahead. She mentioned a tricky shipment for an upcoming event. He talked about investor meetings and a lunch he wished he could cancel. Real life was waiting, but what they'd shared outside the city now felt like part of them. When Derek parked near her apartment, there was no rush to say goodbye. He walked her to the door, kissed her slowly, and said he'd text her later. Samantha walked inside with slow steps, still catching the scent of his coat on her sweater's collar. That night, lying in bed with the hallway light casting a faint glow into her room, Samantha reflected on how all this had started by accident. She still didn't know exactly what it was, but she wasn't trying to define it either. One thing was clear: she didn't want it to end anytime soon. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Derek. "You left your hair clip in the car. I'm keeping it safe. Official excuse to see you again." She laughed quietly, then replied with an emoji and, "Good excuse. Accepted." In the days that followed, Samantha and Derek continued to talk regularly, but there was a new ease between them. Not just because of the message mix-up, but because they both seemed increasingly open to revealing more of themselves. They spoke less guardedly, sharing old embarrassments, quiet fears, small victories, and personal insecurities. Derek, despite his success, was surprisingly candid about the cost of ambition, and Samantha found comfort in his honesty. She, in turn, gave him pieces of her life, stories from hectic events, demanding clients, or the stress of planning something beautiful that no one would notice unless it failed. Their bond no longer felt like a happy accident. It was becoming something they both chose. The following Friday, Samantha left work early. She'd managed to get ahead on a few deadlines and decided to take the rest of the day for herself. She walked slowly through Brooklyn, stopped by her favorite bookstore to pick up a new journal, and then settled into a cozy cafe with something warm to eat. Dusk had just begun to fall when her phone buzzed with a new message from Derek. "Are you home? Mind if I stop by?" She said yes, not sure if he actually would, or if it was just a passing thought. But he showed up. Less than an hour later, her buzzer rang. When she opened the door, he was there, hands in his coat pockets, and that familiar, steady gaze. He stepped inside, took off his jacket, and asked if she had anything for dinner. She told him there was only some soup left in the freezer. He grinned and said that was an easy fix. They ended up sitting on the living room floor with takeout containers spread across a makeshift tray. The TV played quietly in the background, but neither of them paid it much attention. They chatted about random things, laughed over a delivery mix-up, and split the last sandwich cookie. Afterward, they washed dishes together as if it were routine. Later, Derek asked if he could spend the night. Samantha pointed to the couch. He agreed with a smirk, but she shook her head and nodded toward the bedroom. They went in together. The room didn't need an explanation. The lamp still on, shoes kicked off beside the bed, touches slower now, breaths close. They lay there, simply connected. No performance, just warmth. By the time they drifted off, her body was tucked into his, the sheets pulled up loosely, and a quiet contentment filled the space between them. Saturday morning came with damp air outside, but lingering heat under the covers. Samantha woke first, watched him sleep, his chest rising steadily, his face at peace, and felt something soft settle inside her. She got up quietly, made coffee and toast, and returned to find him sitting up, hair tousled and smiling sleepily. They ate breakfast in bed, crumb-covered sheets and all. Neither of them tried to label what was happening. They just lived it. The rest of the weekend passed in that rhythm. Walking through the city when the rain let up, buying flowers for her apartment, watching an old movie and debating its ending. Their shared rhythm was forming naturally. In the weeks that followed, seeing each other became routine without needing to be scheduled. He'd show up with coffee when she was swamped. She'd swing by his place with groceries, and cook while he wrapped up meetings. There wasn't a fixed pattern, sometimes twice a week, sometimes more, but they never went more than a few days without talking or seeing each other. Derek didn't mention the corporate world as much. Samantha spoke of her work with renewed energy, as if something had been rekindled. One Tuesday night, Danielle stopped by and noticed. "You seem steadier," she said. Samantha just smiled. One Sunday evening, curled up together on the couch, Derek asked if she remembered the fake restaurant name they'd made up when rehearsing their story. Samantha paused, then laughed. "The corner table." Derek chuckled. "I think we should actually go there sometime, even if just to design the menu." Samantha nodded, head resting on his chest. In those simple exchanges, plans that bordered on nonsense, small private jokes, they found something solid. What had started with a mistake had turned into something worth continuing. They didn't know what came next, but they knew they wanted to keep going, just like this. And for now, that was enough. The end. If you enjoyed this story, leave us a comment and let us know where you're watching from. See you next time.